Most human music disappeared the moment it was made. Voices left no bones, rhythms left no footprints, and whole worlds of sound vanished without a trace. Then a hollow bird bone emerged from an Ice Age cave shaped for breath and fingers. It preserved no melody, only evidence that someone once knew how to create one. How did a flute from more than 30,000 years ago change what we thought early humans could do? Most of the human past was never silent, yet almost all of its sound has disappeared. Stone can wait beneath the earth for tens of thousands of years. Bone can dry, crack, and still preserve the shape of an animal or the cut of a tool. Ash can remain where a fire once burned. But a voice survives only while breath is moving. A rhythm ends when the hands stop. A melody leaves no layer in the soil, unless some piece of the instrument that carried it happens to endure. This creates a quiet imbalance in the way we understand early humans. Archaeology often begins with what lasts, and what lasts is not always what mattered most. Spears, blades, scrapers, and broken animal bones can show how people hunted, cut meat, shaped hides, and moved through difficult landscapes. They reveal real and necessary work, yet they can also make the distant past appear narrower than it was, as though human life began with survival and ended there. The missing sounds remind us that every camp may once have contained far more than the objects recovered from it. People could speak, call, laugh, soothe children, imitate animals, or repeat patterns of sound, but these actions usually left no physical trace. We should not claim that every early community made music in the way later societies understood it, because the evidence cannot support such certainty. We can only recognize that sound was available to human bodies from the beginning. Breath passing through the throat, hands striking skin or wood, feet meeting the ground, stones touching one another, and voices changing in pitch. These possibilities existed before any known flute, although possibility is not the same as proof. The beginning of human expression, therefore, lies deep within a record that the earth was never able to keep. This is why a small, hollow object can become unusually important. Shaped, it does not preserve the sound itself. It preserves the fact that sound was shaped on purpose through a made object. That difference is easy to overlook. A naturally hollow bone may whistle when air moves across it, but a flute requires deliberate changes to its form. Openings must be created. Edges must be prepared. The object must be held and used in a controlled way. Even before we consider what notes it produced, its existence points toward a connection between hand, breath, hearing, and memory. Someone had to know that altering a piece of bone could alter the air inside it. That knowledge may have been learned through experiment, observation, or teaching, but the surviving material does not tell us which path was taken. It only shows that a practical relationship between matter and sound had been discovered and repeated. For the study of human origins, this matters because it expands the kinds of abilities that can be discussed through direct evidence. Early humans were not represented only by the marks they made while obtaining food or protecting themselves from cold. At least some of them also made objects whose purpose depended on controlled sound. Still, the instrument does not reveal the setting in which it was played. It may have been used alone or among others. It may have accompanied movement, rest, ceremony, teaching, or simple curiosity. None of these possibilities should be presented as a recovered fact. The safest place to begin is with the silence itself. The silence is not evidence that sound was absent. It is evidence that sound is fragile. What reaches us from deep time has passed through a severe filter, one that favors stone over breath, bone over memory, and objects over the moments that gave them meaning. Its survival allows a lost dimension of early life to become visible again, though faintly. The ancient flute stands at the edge of that filter, not as a complete answer, but as one rare opening into everything that vanished. The discovery did not begin with a complete instrument waiting in the earth. It began with small fragments, pale against the darker sediment of a cave floor, each one easy to mistake for an ordinary piece of animal bone. Hohlefels lies in the Swabian Jura of southern Germany, a limestone landscape shaped by valleys, cold seasons, and long periods of human occupation. Archaeologists have worked there carefully because the cave contains layers left by different communities across great stretches of time. Every layer must be recorded before it is disturbed, and every object must be understood in relation to the soil, charcoal, stone tools, animal remains, and other materials found nearby. A fragment without context can tell only a fraction of a story. A fragment recovered from a well-documented layer can be connected to a broader moment in human history. The pieces associated with the flute came from deposits linked with early modern humans in Europe and with the Aurignacian cultural tradition. That term does not describe one single people with one uniform way of life. It is an archaeological label used for patterns in tools, ornaments, carved objects and other remains found across Europe during the early Upper Paleolithic. The label helps researchers compare sites, but it cannot recover the names, languages or identities of the people who once lived there. Inside the cave, the instrument had not remained untouched. Time had broken it. Pressure from sediment, changes in moisture, animal activity, and the ordinary movement of material through a cave can separate one object into many pieces. The work of recognition, therefore, continued long after excavation. Researchers had to notice that several fragments shared the same thickness, curvature, surface treatment, and internal structure. They had to ask whether the pieces belonged together and whether their openings were natural damage or deliberate modifications. This patient process is important because an ancient flute should not be identified merely because a bone contains holes. Carnivore teeth can puncture bone. Roots, erosion, and breakage can alter surfaces. Reliable interpretation depends on the shape of the openings, the marks around them, the arrangement of the holes, and the way the fragments fit into a functional form. Their value also depends on restraint. Archaeologists do not hear original notes when they lift fragments from the ground. They compare measurements, examine tool marks, test possible joins, and consider alternative explanations. Only when lines of evidence agree can the object be described with confidence as a flute. This method protects the past from becoming whatever imagination wants it to be, while allowing discoveries to retain meaning. As the pieces were assembled, the object became less like scattered refuse, and more like a narrow tube made from the wing bone of a large bird, commonly identified as a griffon vulture. Bird wing bones are naturally hollow, which makes them suitable for carrying a column of air, but nature alone did not produce the completed instrument. The surviving form includes several finger holes and a shaped end that could direct breath into sound. Some portions did not survive, so reconstruction still requires caution. The recovered object cannot tell us who made it, how long it was used, or whether it belonged to one person or passed through many hands. It also cannot tell us what the cave felt like when sound moved through it. We should resist filling those gaps with invented scenes. Yet the fragments do establish something firmer. More than 30,000 years ago, people in this region were working bone with enough care to create an object whose function depended on breath, touch, and controlled changes in pitch. The importance lies not in imagining a lost performance, but in recognizing the chain of evidence that survived. A few pieces of bone, recorded in their archaeological setting and studied through their physical features, opened a narrow path back toward the beginning of human musical behavior. A hollow bone with openings is not automatically a musical instrument. In caves and open landscapes, bones can be pierced, crushed, polished, or split by many forces that have nothing to do with human intention. Teeth may leave rounded punctures. Roots may press through weakened surfaces. Water can widen cracks, and sediment can grind sharp edges until damage looks older and smoother than it really is. Because of this, the identification of an ancient flute depends on a combination of features rather than on one dramatic sign. Researchers examine the placement of the openings, the shape of their edges, the marks left by cutting tools, the thickness of the bone, and the way the object could have been held and sounded. When several openings appear in a measured line along a narrow hollow tube, the possibility of deliberate manufacture becomes stronger. When those openings also show traces consistent with scraping, cutting, or careful enlargement, natural explanations become less convincing. The object from Hohlefels carries this kind of evidence. Its surviving holes are arranged where fingers could cover and uncover them, and its form includes a prepared area through which air could be directed. This does not mean every detail of its original design is known. Some pieces are missing, and damage accumulated over thousands of years. Yet the preserved structure is coherent enough to show that the bone was altered for controlled sound. The distinction matters because early human history is often reconstructed from objects that no longer perform their original task. A stone blade may be blunt. A wooden handle may be gone. A pigment may have faded. In the same way, the flute no longer carries the breath of its maker, but its design preserves the relationship between bodily action and expected result. Covering one opening would have changed the vibrating length of air inside the tube. Uncovering another would have changed it again. The maker did not need modern acoustic theory, but the finished object depended on practical knowledge of cause and effect. That knowledge had to exist in action before it could appear in archaeological form. Someone had to shape the edge, place the holes, test the airflow, and recognize whether the result worked. The evidence cannot reveal whether this process took one attempt or many, whether it was taught by another person, or whether similar instruments had already been made for generations. It only allows a careful conclusion. The object was not a random bone that happened to whistle. It was shaped so that breath and fingers could produce different sounds. The instrument also shows that its maker could coordinate hearing, breath, touch, and memory across repeated actions. Each successful tone depended on the body returning to a learned position, suggesting practiced control rather than a single accidental encounter with a hollow bone in isolation. This brings the question back to the origins of human behavior. The important change is not that early people suddenly became capable of music at one exact date. No surviving artifact can establish such a beginning. Voice, clapping, percussion, and instruments made from wood or reed may have existed much earlier without leaving recoverable traces. The flute instead marks the earliest secure point at which one form of musical behavior becomes materially visible. It gives archaeology something solid enough to measure, compare, and test. At the same time, it warns us not to confuse first evidence with first existence. What survives is only the earliest object found and accepted with confidence, not necessarily the earliest object ever made. The shaped bone therefore stands between certainty and absence. Its holes are clear enough to demonstrate deliberate design, but its lost sounds prevent complete reconstruction. It proves that people could transform a natural material into a device for controlled tone, while leaving open the larger questions of how they learned, why they played, and what those sounds meant within their lives. The material of the Hohlefels flute was not an ordinary solid bone. It came from the wing of a large bird, commonly identified as a griffon vulture, whose long flight bones contain a naturally hollow interior. That feature gave early craftspeople a form that already resembled the body of a wind instrument. A hollow tube can hold a moving column of air, and when air is directed across a prepared edge, that column can begin to vibrate. The bone therefore offered an important starting point, but it did not become a flute simply because nature had made it light and empty. Its usefulness depended on the relationship between size, strength, shape, and the way human hands could alter it. Bird bones are thin enough to work with stone tools, yet they can remain firm when handled carefully. Their long, narrow form allows several openings to be placed along one side without requiring the maker to construct the entire tube from separate pieces. This reduced one difficulty while leaving many others. The surface could crack, the walls could split under pressure. A badly placed cut might destroy the material before the instrument was finished. Selecting a suitable bone was therefore only the beginning of a process that required control. Archaeologists cannot know exactly how the maker chose this particular piece. It may have been selected because its size appeared useful, because similar objects had been made before, or because experience had shown that certain bird bones worked better than others. None of these possibilities can be confirmed from the surviving object alone. What can be observed is that the chosen bone had physical qualities well suited to producing sound. Its hollow center could support airflow, its length allowed changes in pitch, and its surface could be shaped with the tools available at the time. The animal itself also belonged to the environment known by people living in Ice Age Europe. Large birds were present in the wider landscape, and their remains could enter human use in several ways. Yet the flute does not tell us whether the bird was hunted specifically for its bone, found after death, or acquired during the processing of an animal taken for another reason. Scientific caution begins by separating the material we can identify from the story we cannot recover. For the study of human origins, this choice of material reveals a practical awareness of natural form. Early humans did not need to invent hollowness. They recognized, used, and transformed a structure already present in the body of another species. This pattern appears throughout human technological history. Stone offers sharp edges, hide offers flexible covering, wood offers length and strength, and bone offers shapes that can be adapted for particular tasks. The flute belongs within this broader ability to notice useful properties in the environment. What makes it unusual is the purpose toward which those properties were directed. The finished object was not primarily a cutting edge, a container, or a weapon. Its function depended on breath entering the tube, and on fingers changing the movement of air. In that sense, a structure that once supported flight became a means of producing controlled sound. The transformation is striking, but it should not be romanticized into a claim that one person suddenly discovered music. The archaeological record cannot show the first experiment, the first successful note, or the generations of knowledge that may have preceded the surviving flute. It shows only that by the time this instrument was made, someone understood enough about bone, airflow, and careful shaping to bring them together. That understanding was embodied in repeated movements of the hands, in judgments about thickness and distance, and in the patience required to protect a fragile tube while gradually changing its form carefully. A natural object had become a cultural one, carrying evidence that early human skill extended beyond using materials as they were found. Turning a bird bone into a playable flute required more than making a few holes in a hollow tube. The surface first had to be cleaned enough for its natural shape to be seen and handled. Any remaining tissue, grease, or irregular material could interfere with cutting, measuring, and holding the bone securely. Archaeologists cannot reconstruct every movement used by the maker, but microscopic marks and experimental work with similar materials help identify a plausible sequence. Stone flakes can scrape, score, and cut bone when used with patience. Rather than forcing the tool deeply in one motion, a craftsperson could create a shallow groove, return to it repeatedly, and gradually remove material. This method would reduce the risk of splitting the thin wall. The ends of the bone also needed attention. One end had to allow breath to enter in a controlled way, while the other helped determine the effective length of the air column. The surviving flute from Hohlefels includes a shaped blowing end, although damage and missing fragments prevent a complete reconstruction of every detail. What remains is enough to show deliberate preparation rather than accidental breakage. Creating the finger holes demanded another kind of control. A hole that was too small might restrict the desired change in sound. A hole enlarged too quickly could crack the tube or weaken the surrounding wall. The maker may have cut, scraped, drilled, or rotated a pointed stone tool against the surface, but the exact combination of motions cannot be known with certainty. What can be said is that the openings were placed in a useful line where fingers could reach them. Their spacing had to work with the length of the bone and with the size of the human hand. This linked the object directly to the body. The flute was not merely shaped according to the material, it was shaped for repeated contact with breath, lips, and fingers. Such work required the hands to perform different tasks in a stable order. One hand might support the fragile tube, while the other applied pressure. The angle of the tool had to change as the opening widened. The craftsperson had to notice whether the edge was becoming smooth, whether the bone was beginning to split, and whether enough material had been removed. These judgments did not require written measurements or formal acoustic theory. They required attention, memory, and experience with cause and effect. A small change in the bone could produce a large change in the finished object. This is why the flute connects so clearly with the beginnings of human technical planning. Its manufacture involved a goal that could not be fully tested until several earlier actions had already succeeded. The tube had to survive cleaning, the blowing edge had to function, the holes had to remain open and stable. Only then could breath reveal whether the object produced controlled tones. The archaeological evidence does not tell us whether the maker worked alone, learned by watching another person, or followed a tradition already familiar within the group. It also does not show how many failed attempts may have disappeared from the record. Broken experiments could have been discarded, burned, or lost among ordinary animal remains. The surviving flute is therefore not proof of effortless mastery. It is evidence that at least one demanding sequence was completed successfully. Testing may also have occurred throughout the work rather than only at the end. A maker could blow across the tube, listen for a response, adjust an edge, and test again. Even so, The marks cannot preserve the order, duration, or number of those trials. From a light bird bone, stone tools, steady hands, and repeated decisions, an object emerged whose purpose depended on sound that could not be seen. That quiet achievement reveals how early humans could coordinate material knowledge with bodily control, long before any written explanation of music existed. A flute can survive only if every important decision remains within narrow limits. The bone may be naturally hollow, but its usefulness depends on how carefully that hollow form is altered. A finger hole placed too close to the edge could weaken the wall. One made too large could change the tone more than intended. A cut made with too much pressure could split the tube from one opening to the next, ending the work before any sound was produced. These risks make the finished instrument valuable evidence of controlled skill. The maker did not merely remove material, each removal changed what could happen later. Once a hole had been opened, it could be enlarged, but it could not easily be moved. Once a crack began, the thin wall offered little room for repair. The sequence therefore demanded caution, because every successful action depended on preserving the result of the actions that came before it. Experimental archaeology helps modern researchers understand this difficulty. By working fresh or prepared bird bone with stone tools, they can observe how slowly an opening develops, how easily the surface splinters, and how much control is required to produce smooth edges. These experiments do not recreate the exact methods of the ancient maker, and they cannot prove how long the work took. They provide a practical comparison between what is physically possible and what the surviving marks suggest. Through such comparisons, the flute appears less like a simple object and more like the outcome of repeated judgment. Distance also mattered. The openings had to fit along the available length of the bone while remaining reachable by human fingers. Their placement influenced the effective air column, and therefore the range of tones the instrument could produce. We should not assume that the maker calculated pitch with numerical ratios or followed a musical scale familiar today. The evidence supports a more cautious conclusion. The person or tradition behind the flute understood, through practice, that changing the position and size of openings changed the sound. That knowledge may have been learned by testing, by imitation, or through instruction from someone more experienced. The object alone cannot distinguish among these paths. Still, the final arrangement shows that sound was anticipated before the instrument was complete. This anticipation is central to the history of human behavior. Many tools reveal planning because their useful form appears only after several steps. A flute adds another dimension. Its success cannot be judged by sight alone. A tube may look finished and still fail to sound clearly. The maker had to connect visible changes in bone with invisible changes in moving air, then evaluate the result through hearing and bodily sensation. Breath pressure, lip position, finger coverage, and the shape of the edge all interacted. A problem in one element could be mistaken for a problem in another. Learning to recognize these differences likely required repetition, although the number of trials remains unknown. The surviving instrument therefore represents more than delicate craftsmanship. It preserves a chain-linking material, body, sound, and memory. At the beginning of human musical history, this chain may have existed long before any object survived to reveal it. Voices could carry patterns without tools, and wood or reed instruments could vanish completely. The bone flute does not mark the birth of music. It marks a moment when musical knowledge entered a durable material and passed through time. Its precise holes are not impressive because they prove perfection. They matter because they show that early humans could work within fragile limits, adjust their actions toward an unseen result, and complete an object whose value emerged only when another human body breathed into it. Nothing in that process resembles chance. The instrument remained possible only because error was repeatedly avoided, noticed, or corrected before the bone could no longer be saved. Its survival preserves the discipline hidden behind each successful ancient note. When a person blows into a flute, the breath does not become music simply by entering a hollow tube. The moving air must meet an edge in a particular way. Part of the stream passes across the opening, while part interacts with the air already inside. This disturbance causes pressure to rise and fall in a repeating pattern, and the column of air begins to vibrate. What the ear receives as a tone is the result of that movement. The bone itself may also respond slightly, but the main sounding element is the air held within the instrument. This simple principle links the human body to the object. Lungs provide pressure, the mouth shapes the stream, the lips guide it, and the hands determine which openings remain covered. A stable tone appears only when these actions work together. Too little air may produce a weak or uncertain sound. Too much may cause the tone to break or shift. If the breath strikes the edge at the wrong angle, the instrument may answer with noise instead of a clear note. Playing therefore requires learned control, not merely the ability to exhale. The ancient flute from Hohlefels preserves the material conditions for this process. Even though it cannot preserve the movements of the original player, its shaped blowing end suggests that air was meant to be directed rather than released randomly. The finger holes allowed the player to change the effective length of the vibrating air column. When all holes are closed, the air behaves as though it is moving through a longer tube. Opening a hole creates a new point where pressure can interact with the outside air, shortening the active length and generally raising the pitch. The exact result depends on many details, including hole size, spacing, tube shape, and blowing technique. Because the instrument is incomplete and altered by time, modern reconstructions cannot recover every original tone with certainty. Yet the physical relationship remains clear enough to show deliberate acoustic control. A finger lifted from one opening would change the sound. Another combination would change it again. The flute therefore transformed small movements of the body into changes that could be heard by others. This is important for understanding the beginnings of human musical behavior because it shows coordination across several systems at once. Breath had to remain steady. Fingers had to cover openings closely enough to prevent unwanted leakage. Hearing had to detect whether the intended response had occurred. Memory had to retain useful positions and movements so that a tone could be repeated. None of this proves that early players used named notes, fixed scales, or compositions resembling later music. Those ideas belong to cultural systems for which no evidence survives here. The safer conclusion is more modest and still significant. Early modern humans in Ice Age Europe possessed and used an object capable of producing controlled differences in pitch through patterned bodily action. The sound was not stored inside the bone. It had to be recreated each time through a meeting of breath, material, and learned movement. In that sense, the flute was incomplete while silent. Its full function existed only when a living person animated it. This relationship may help explain why musical instruments are so difficult to understand from archaeology alone. The object survives, but performance does not. We can examine the openings and estimate how air moved, yet we cannot observe posture, breathing habits, fingering sequences, or the social setting in which tones were heard. Still, the basic mechanism provides a firm foundation. A hollow bone was shaped so that invisible air could be divided, shortened, and set into ordered vibration. More than 30,000 years ago, human breath could already pass through crafted material and return as a sound intentionally changed by the fingers. The player's body and the crafted bone became one system, joined for as long as breath continued. The spacing of finger holes on an ancient flute invites a conclusion. It may seem possible to measure the distances, compare them with notes, and declare that the maker followed a musical scale. Yet this would move beyond what the object can tell us. The position of each opening affected the sound. A hole placed nearer the blowing end shortened the active air column more than one placed farther away, producing a higher pitch when opened. The size of the opening, the shape of the tube, and the way the player directed breath influenced the result. These relationships are physical, but the meanings attached to them are cultural. A sequence of pitches may resemble intervals recognized today without proving that ancient players understood, named, or organized those sounds in the same way. The surviving flute gives evidence of controlled variation, not a written theory of music. Its holes are spaced so that fingers could reach them, and their arrangement allowed more than one tone to be produced. This shows that the maker was not simply creating a whistle with a single sound. The object offered a field of choices. Different combinations of covered and uncovered openings changed the length and pressure patterns of the air inside. With practice, a player could return to particular finger positions and produce contrasts in pitch. Repetition is important because a sound that can be intentionally repeated can become one element within a learned pattern, even when no notation exists. Still, the order of those patterns is lost. We do not know whether players moved between neighbouring tones, favoured wide jumps, repeated a few sounds, or used the flute for signals rather than extended melodies. The instrument permits several possibilities, but permission is not proof. At the beginning of human musical behaviour, caution matters. Archaeology can reveal that early people shaped an object capable of tonal variation, yet it cannot recover the rules they may have followed while using it. Those rules might have been stable within a community, flexible between performances, or different from one player to another. They may have changed over generations. The bone preserves geometry, while tradition has disappeared. Replicas can help researchers test which tones a reconstructed flute might produce. By matching the surviving dimensions, makers can explore how hole placement affects pitch, and how easily the instrument responds to breath. These experiments are useful, but they carry limitations. Missing fragments must be estimated. The original bone may have changed through drying, pressure, or damage. The reconstructed blowing edge may not match the ancient one exactly. Even a carefully made copy can sound different in the hands of two players because breath angle, lip shape, and finger coverage vary. A list of notes produced today is not a recovered Ice Age tune. It is a demonstration of acoustic possibilities. The distances between the holes reflect the human body. A design that cannot be comfortably covered would be difficult to play, so spacing had to balance acoustic effect with reach. This balance joins natural law with anatomy. The length of the bone limited where openings could be placed. The hands limited how widely they could be separated. The desired changes in sound, whatever their cultural purpose, had to emerge within those boundaries. More than 30,000 years ago, the maker worked inside the same physical world that governs instruments now. But the musical world built upon those forces may have been different. The flute changes our understanding without allowing a simple translation. It shows that early humans could create a device with several controllable pitches and could coordinate those pitches through learned finger movements. It does not show that they played modern scales, composed songs in familiar forms, or heard intervals with the same expectations we bring today. The holes preserve a structure for choice. The choices themselves, once made in breath and time, disappeared with the people who heard them. Modern replicas can bring an ancient flute close to sound again, but they cannot return the music that once passed through it. Researchers may copy the surviving length, hole positions, wall thickness, and blowing edge, then test how the instrument responds to breath. These experiments can show whether the reconstructed form is playable, which fingerings are possible, and how changes in airflow affect pitch. They can also reveal practical limits. Some tones may require careful breath control. Certain holes may be difficult to cover fully. A small change in the angle of the mouth may alter the response. This knowledge helps explain how the object could have functioned, but it does not recover a performance. Every replica contains decisions where the original is incomplete. Missing fragments must be estimated. Damaged edges must be interpreted. The ancient bone may have changed shape through drying, pressure, and long burial. Even when measurements are precise, the recreated instrument remains a modern object made from modern choices. The player also brings a body trained within a present musical culture. Breath habits, expectations of pitch, and familiar finger patterns can influence what is heard and what is attempted. A sequence that sounds natural today may never have existed in the Ice Age. For this reason, a replica should be treated as a test of possibility rather than a recording recovered from the past. It can demonstrate that several distinct tones are physically available. It cannot tell us which tones were preferred, how long they were held, or whether they were arranged into repeating melodies. Rhythm is even harder to recover because no movement survives. The flute may have been played slowly, rapidly, alone, with voices, with clapping, or without any regular pulse. None of these settings can be confirmed from the instrument itself. The social meaning is equally distant. Sound may have accompanied rest, teaching, ceremony, play, storytelling, or communication across space. It may have served several purposes at different times. The evidence allows these as possibilities, but it does not allow one of them to become fact simply because it is appealing. This boundary is central to honest work on human origins. The temptation to hear an ancient melody is strong because the object feels close to us. It fits the hand, responds to breath, and can produce tones that a modern ear recognizes as musical. Yet familiarity can create false confidence. The same physical sound may have carried a different meaning for the people who made and heard it. Their expectations, memories, and traditions did not survive inside the bone. What remains is the capacity for controlled sound, not the content of the sound. That distinction does not weaken the discovery. It makes the evidence clearer. More than 30,000 years ago, early modern humans in Europe had already created an instrument capable of producing repeatable changes in pitch. They had linked craft, hearing, breath, and finger movement into a working system. We can test that system because the object still exists. We cannot restore the exact patterns once created through it because those patterns lived only in time. Music disappears as it happens unless some method preserves it, and no notation, recording, or direct description survives from this world. The replica therefore stands beside the original as a careful question. It asks what the instrument could do, not what it certainly did. The answer is limited but meaningful. The flute could transform controlled breath into varied tones. It could support repeated finger positions and audible contrasts. Beyond that point, the evidence grows quiet. Its silence preserves a final lesson. Archaeology can recover materials, techniques, and physical possibilities with care, while the lived arrangement of sound remains within the human past that no object can ever hold. The lost melodies remain beyond reconstruction, reminding us that the beginning of human music is visible only through the narrow opening left by a silent instrument. Ivory presented a very different challenge from bird bone. A bird wing bone already contains a hollow passage, so the maker begins with a natural tube. Mammoth ivory is solid. It is dense, curved, and layered, and it cannot become a flute through a few simple cuts. To create an air channel inside it, the material first has to be divided, shaped, hollowed, and joined again with enough precision to hold moving air. This makes ivory flutes especially important for understanding early human craftsmanship. Their existence suggests not merely the use of a suitable object found in nature, but the deliberate construction of a form that nature did not provide ready-made. The maker had to work against the material while also using its strength. Ivory can take a smooth finish and preserve a stable shape, yet it can crack or split unpredictably if pressure follows the grain in the wrong way. Its curvature adds another difficulty. A straight tube is easier to imagine, measure, and assemble. A curved piece requires careful decisions about where to cut, how much material to remove, and how the two halves will meet again. Archaeologists studying such objects rely on tool marks, fracture patterns, joins, and experimental comparison to understand what may have happened. They do not recover a written set of instructions. The process must be reconstructed from the object itself and from what stone tools can physically achieve. One plausible sequence begins with selecting a workable section of tusk, then separating it lengthwise into narrow pieces. Each piece could be shaped on the outside and hollowed on the inside, creating matching channels. The two halves would then need to be fitted together so that air could travel through the joined tube without escaping through gaps. Small openings for the fingers and a prepared blowing end would be added with similar care. Every stage created a new risk. If the halves were uneven, the seam might leak. If too much ivory was removed, the walls could become weak. If too little was removed, the air channel might remain too narrow or irregular. Because the object depended on several stages succeeding together, the finished flute preserves evidence of planning over time. This does not mean the maker imagined every detail in a modern technical drawing. Practical knowledge can exist in repeated actions, learned sequences, and adjustments made during work. Still, the result required a goal stable enough to guide many separate operations. At the beginning of human musical history, this matters because it shows that controlled sound could justify a large investment of labour and attention. A bird bone flute could take advantage of a natural hollow. An ivory flute demanded that the hollow be created. The difference reveals two levels of engagement with material, recognizing a useful form and building that form from solid substance. We cannot know why ivory was chosen in a particular case. It may have offered durability, availability, symbolic value, or simply a tradition already known to the group. The archaeological evidence does not allow one explanation to become certain. What it does allow is a clearer view of technical difficulty. Early humans were capable of completing a fragile, multi-step object whose success depended on invisible airflow inside a seam that had to remain closed. The final instrument therefore joined several kinds of knowledge at once: the structure of ivory, the behavior of stone tools, the limits of the human hand, and the acoustic effect of a continuous inner tube. When breath eventually passed through it, the sound depended on every hidden surface the maker had shaped before the instrument was ever heard. Unlike a visible blade, whose sharpness could be judged, the ivory flute concealed much of its essential workmanship inside. The maker could inspect the surface, but only breath would reveal whether the joined channel was continuous, stable, and capable of answering the fingers with changes in tone. An ivory flute could not be made by simply opening a passage through the center of a tusk. Mammoth ivory is solid, curved, and built from layers that respond differently to pressure. To create a hollow tube, the maker first had to divide a narrow piece of ivory along its length. The exact tools and order of every movement cannot be recovered, but archaeological traces and experimental work suggest that cutting, scraping, and careful splitting were all possible with sharp stone implements. Once separated, the two long pieces had to be shaped so that their outer surfaces formed the body of the instrument, while their inner faces carried matching grooves. Each groove represented half of the future air channel. If one side became deeper than the other, the tube might narrow unevenly. If the surfaces twisted away from each other, the joined instrument could leak. The work therefore demanded repeated comparison between the halves. Material had to be removed slowly, not only to avoid cracking the ivory, but also to preserve enough thickness for the finished walls. The inner grooves were especially important because they would become hidden after assembly. A rough or interrupted channel could disturb the air, while a gap along the seam could prevent stable tones from forming. The maker had no modern gauge for checking these dimensions, yet practical judgment could be built through touch, sight, experience, and repeated testing. The halves could be placed together, examined, separated, adjusted, and joined again until their edges met closely. Archaeologists have proposed that binding or an adhesive substance may have helped hold such pieces together, but the surviving evidence does not always reveal exactly which method was used for every instrument. It is safer to say that the seam had to remain sufficiently closed for the flute to function. Once the tube was assembled, finger holes and a blowing edge had to connect the hidden channel with the body of the player. These openings could not be treated independently. Cutting through one wall too aggressively might reach the seam or weaken the tube. Their positions had to remain accessible to the fingers while also producing useful changes in the length of vibrating air. The finished instrument therefore depended on accuracy across surfaces that were visible and surfaces that would disappear from view. This reveals a form of planning closely tied to the origins of complex human craft. The goal was not present in any single piece of ivory. It emerged only when separate elements were made to cooperate. Two solid halves became one hollow body. A hidden groove became a path for breath. Small openings became points where fingers could alter sound. None of these features had full value alone. Their function appeared through assembly. We cannot know whether one person performed every operation or whether several people contributed different skills. We also cannot know how many unfinished or broken examples were discarded before a successful flute was completed. The surviving object records success more clearly than failure, which can make ancient craftsmanship appear more direct than it probably was. Even so, the completed tube demonstrates that early humans could maintain a distant result through many vulnerable stages. They worked on material that would not reveal its acoustic behavior until the halves were joined and breath passed through the channel. A mistake made near the beginning could remain hidden until the end. This requirement separates the ivory flute from objects completed through one decisive action, because its usefulness depended on carefully preserved relationships across the entire chain of manufacture. The ivory flute therefore preserved more than sound-making ability. It preserved a sequence of decisions in which inner form, outer shape, bodily reach, and airflow had to agree. More than 30,000 years ago, a solid piece of mammoth tusk could be divided, hollowed, reunited, and transformed into an instrument whose voice depended on a seam made almost invisible. An ivory flute could exist only if its maker worked toward a result that was not yet visible. At the beginning, there was no hollow tube, no finished finger hole, and no sound to confirm that the work was moving in the right direction. There was only a solid piece of mammoth tusk, whose useful form had to be imagined through a sequence of changes. The ivory needed to be divided, the two faces had to be shaped, matching grooves had to be hollowed, and the edges had to meet again well enough to contain moving air. Each action prepared a condition required by actions that would come later. If the first split wandered too far, the halves might become uneven. If the inner channels failed to match, the joined tube might leak. If the outer walls became too thin, later cutting could destroy the instrument. The maker, therefore, had to preserve possibilities that could not yet be tested. This is one of the clearest reasons the ivory flute matters in the study of early human behavior. It shows planning not as an abstract idea, but as a practical relationship between present movement and future function. We should not picture a modern blueprint held in the mind, because no evidence supports such a specific claim. Human planning can operate through learned routines, remembered examples, careful comparison, and repeated correction. A craftsperson may know what must happen next without representing the whole process in words or measurements. Even so, the finished flute required a stable direction across many vulnerable stages. The goal could not change completely after every cut. The work had to remain organized around the future passage of breath through a tube that did not yet exist. This connects the instrument with a broader pattern in human origins. Many early technologies depended on preparing materials for later use. Stone cores were shaped so that useful flakes could be removed. Hides were worked so they could become coverings. Fibers may have been twisted or tied into forms that rarely survived. The ivory flute belongs to this history of delayed results, but its purpose adds a distinctive difficulty. A cutting tool can often be judged by sight and touch as its edge develops. An instrument must eventually be judged by sound, and sound arrives only when the hidden channel, blowing edge, finger holes, and human breath cooperate. Much of the essential work remained concealed inside the joined halves. The maker could examine alignment, feel the seam, and adjust the surface, but only a successful test would reveal whether air moved as intended. That test may have led to further corrections, although the surviving traces cannot show how many. The object records a completed solution, not the uncertainty that surrounded its making. It also suggests that knowledge could be carried beyond one moment. A complex sequence is easier to complete when useful actions are remembered, demonstrated, or learned from earlier attempts. This does not prove a formal teaching system, nor does it show who instructed whom. It simply raises the likelihood that flute making belonged to a body of practical knowledge larger than an accidental discovery. The makers of such instruments may have inherited methods, altered them, and passed them onward, but archaeology cannot follow every link in that chain. What remains is the result: solid ivory transformed into a hollow device whose function depended on invisible air. More than 30,000 years ago, early humans were able to maintain attention across a demanding sequence and protect a distant goal through fragile material. The achievement does not require claims that they thought exactly as people do now. It requires only recognition that their hands were guided by memory, anticipation, and an understanding that several unfinished actions could eventually become one working object. The flute began as material without a voice, yet its makers shaped every hidden surface toward the possibility of sound. The people associated with the earliest secure flutes in the Swabian Jura belong to the first populations of Homo sapiens known to have lived widely in Europe. They entered a continent that was not empty. Neanderthals had occupied many regions for a very long time, adapting to changing climates, hunting large animals, making tools, and moving through landscapes that demanded skill and endurance. The arrival of modern humans, therefore, did not begin a simple story in which one group stepped into an unused world and immediately replaced another. Archaeological evidence points instead to a complex period in which different human populations existed across parts of Europe, sometimes separated by distance and time, and possibly overlapping in certain regions. The surviving record remains incomplete, so the pace and character of their encounters cannot be described with certainty. What matters for the flute is that it appeared within this broader movement of people, knowledge, and material traditions. The instrument was found in a region where caves preserved traces of repeated human activity, including stone tools, worked bone, ornaments, and carved objects. These remains are commonly connected with the Aurignacian, an archaeological tradition associated in Europe with early modern humans. The term helps researchers organize patterns found across many sites, but it should not be mistaken for the name of a single tribe or nation. The people who made these objects may have belonged to communities with different histories, relationships, and ways of speaking. Their own identities are lost. What survives are fragments of behavior preserved in stone, bone, ivory, and sediment. The flute belongs among these fragments, yet it changes how the larger movement into Europe can be understood. Migration was not only the movement of bodies searching for food and shelter, it also carried skills, habits, memories, and ways of shaping experience. A person crossing a valley could carry a tool, but knowledge could travel even when the object itself was left behind. Techniques for cutting bone, preparing ivory, controlling breath, or teaching finger positions could move through generations and between groups. The archaeological record cannot show exactly how musical knowledge travelled, but the presence of several flutes made from different materials suggests that sound production was not limited to one accidental object. It belonged to a wider field of practiced behaviour. This does not prove that music gave modern humans an advantage over Neanderthals, and it should not be used as a simple explanation for why one population later disappeared. Human population change involved climate, demography, movement, contact, competition, cooperation, and other forces that remain subjects of research. A flute cannot carry that burden of explanation. Its value is quieter. It shows that people entering Ice Age Europe brought or developed traditions that included controlled sound alongside the tools of survival. This returns us to the beginning of human expression. The earliest secure flutes do not mark the moment when imagination suddenly appeared. They reveal that by this stage human communities were already investing effort in objects whose purpose was not limited to cutting, scraping, or killing. Such objects may have helped organize attention, memory, movement, or social connection, although their exact use is unknown. The important point is that survival and expression were not separate worlds. The same hands that prepared food, shaped tools, and managed cold conditions could also shape a tube for breath. The same communities that moved through uncertain landscapes could preserve knowledge that had meaning beyond immediate physical need. As modern humans spread across Europe, they did not leave behind a complete account of themselves. They left scattered evidence that movement through the world also involved carrying invisible traditions. Its presence warns us that populations should not be reduced to bones and genes alone, because learned practices could shape continuity even when people lived in small, mobile groups. The flute is one surviving sign that the journey into Europe was cultural as well as biological. The Swabian Jura was not a fixed white wilderness, and the people who moved through it did not experience one unchanging Ice Age climate. Conditions shifted across generations, sometimes becoming colder or drier, while local valleys, slopes, patches of woodland, and open ground created a varied landscape. Evidence from animals and sediments suggests environments that often included cold steppe or tundra-like areas, though vegetation and local shelter could differ from place to place. Mammoths, reindeer, wild horses, woolly rhinoceroses, and other large animals belonged to this wider world at different times. Their presence did not mean every species stood together outside every cave. Faunal remains accumulate through hunting, scavenging, carnivore activity, natural death, and the movement of bones, so each deposit must be interpreted carefully. Even with those limits, the general setting was demanding. Food was spread across a broad territory. Herds moved. Water, fuel, stone, animal materials, and protected resting places were not concentrated in one permanent settlement. Human groups likely travelled repeatedly through familiar routes, adjusting their movements to seasons, resources, and social needs, although the precise pattern of any community is lost. The limestone valleys of the region offered caves and rock shelters that could be visited, reused, or left empty. A cave may have protected people from wind and rain, provided a place for firelight and work, or served as a temporary point within a much larger landscape. It should not be imagined automatically as a permanent home occupied without interruption. Layers inside holofels represent separate episodes accumulated across long spans of time, not one continuous household preserved intact. This distinction changes how the flute can be understood. The instrument belonged to people whose lives may have required frequent movement, yet it was light enough to be carried and small enough to remain close to the body. A bone flute did not provide warmth or food, but it could travel beside objects that did. Its presence shows that mobility did not reduce human life to the heaviest necessities. Knowledge, habits, sounds, and crafted forms could move with a group even when shelters were temporary. Near the beginning of the known European history of Homo sapiens, culture was therefore not tied only to a permanent building or a settled village. It could be held in memory, practiced through the body, and carried in a narrow tube of bone. Movement also shaped what archaeology preserves. A group might repair tools in one place, process animals in another, and leave only a few objects at a brief stopping point. Many possessions made from wood, hide, fibre, or plant material would decay. A broken stone tool might remain, while a usable instrument could leave the site in someone's hands. The flutes recovered from caves are therefore rare links between human movement and accidental preservation. They survived because they were lost, broken, discarded, or left behind under conditions that protected fragments from complete destruction. We cannot know which circumstance applies to every object. What we can see is that musical craftsmanship existed within a life organized across space. Cold air would have affected breath and fingers. Fragile bone needed protection during travel. Ivory required time and tools to shape. These practical conditions make the instruments more meaningful, not because they prove that music defeated hardship, but because they show that people carried complex practices through hardship. The landscape demanded attention to animals, weather, roots, and materials, while the flute demanded attention to breath, touch, and sound. Both forms of knowledge belong to the same human beings. In the deep history of our species, the capacity to move through a difficult environment and the capacity to preserve a tradition were not separate achievements. A melody, unlike shelter, could cross the landscape without leaving a permanent structure behind for later archaeologists. The ancient instrument rested within that connection, joining a temporary camp to memories and skills that could continue beyond the cave. The flute did not appear alone within the caves of the Swabian Jura. In the same Aurignacian world, archaeologists have found carved figures, personal ornaments, worked bone, ivory objects, and shaped stone tools. Some figurines represent animals known from the Ice Age landscape, including mammoths, horses, birds, and large cats. Others combine human and animal features, while one ivory figure from Hohlefels represents a female body. These objects differ in form and possible use, yet together they widen the picture of early modern human life in Europe. The flute was not an isolated curiosity produced by people otherwise concerned only with hunting and shelter. It belonged to communities capable of directing skilled labour towards several kinds of crafted expression. This does not mean that art, ornament, and music suddenly appeared everywhere at one moment. Archaeological discoveries are uneven, and preservation favours some places and materials over others. Earlier traditions may have existed in regions where objects decayed, sites were destroyed, or research has not yet found them. The Aurignacian record of the Swabian Jura is important because several rare forms of evidence survived within a landscape, not because it proves that all symbolic behaviour began there. Inside those caves, carved ivory and musical instruments entered the ground beside the remains of ordinary work. Stone flakes, animal bones, hearth traces, and broken tools show activities connected with food, warmth, movement, and repair. Figurines and ornaments did not exist outside that practical world. They were made from materials gathered through the same landscape and shaped by hands that also performed necessary daily tasks. Mammoth ivory could become a tool, an ornament, a small carved animal, or a flute. Bone could carry a sharp point or a column of air. The difference lay in the sequence of actions and the use toward which the material was directed. For the history of human origins, this combination is more informative than a simple contrast between survival and creativity. Early people did not need to finish surviving before they could shape meaningful objects. Survival was never a completed task. Cold returned, animals moved, tools broke, and people still devoted attention to forms whose purposes cannot be reduced to calories or physical protection. A pendant may have marked identity, relationship, memory, or status, but its exact meaning is lost. A figurine may have been held, displayed, exchanged, taught with, or used in ways that leave no trace. A flute may have produced tones for listeners, for one player alone, or for circumstances we cannot recover. The safest conclusion is not that all these objects serve the same symbolic system, It is that early modern humans in this region repeatedly transformed materials into forms whose value depended partly on learned cultural understanding. A carved horse is not useful because ivory naturally resembles a horse. Its significance depends on people recognizing the form. An ornament becomes socially meaningful only when others understand something about wearing, seeing, or exchanging it. A flute becomes fully functional only when someone knows how to direct breath and fingers through a learned technique. Each object, therefore, connects individual skill with a community of attention. The caves preserve these connections only in fragments, but the pattern matters. More than 30,000 years ago, sound, image, bodily display, and technical work were already present within the same archaeological tradition. This does not justify calling the period a sudden revolution, as though human minds changed in a single generation. It suggests a deeper process in which abilities, traditions, and population histories accumulated across time. The flute changed our view because it stood beside other evidence showing that the first modern humans of this region carried a cultural life larger than any one artifact could reveal. Together, these objects do not provide a complete portrait, but they show that the human beginning in Europe included making forms that could be heard, seen, worn, remembered, and passed onward. A stone blade usually acts where one hand directs it. A scraper touches one hide. A spear travels toward one target. Sound behaves differently. Once released, it can spread beyond the body that produced it and enter the attention of several people at the same time. This does not prove that every ancient flute was played for a group, but it helps explain why a musical instrument could carry social possibilities unlike those of many other tools. Breath became vibration. Vibration moved through the air, and listeners did not need to hold the object to receive its effect. A single player could therefore create an experience shared across a small space. In a cave, sound might have reflected from stone walls and reached people gathered near a fire. In open ground, it might have carried only a short distance before wind and landscape weakened it. The exact setting is unknown, and no performance can be reconstructed with certainty. Yet the physical nature of sound remains relevant. It is temporary, but while it exists, it can connect several bodies through one moment of attention. This makes the flute important to the study of human beginnings. Early social life depended on more than individual skill. People moved, watched, waited, learned, and responded to one another. A sound that could be repeated may have helped draw attention, mark a change, accompany movement, or create a shared pause. These are reasonable possibilities, not recovered facts. The instrument alone cannot tell us whether listeners sat quietly, moved their bodies, spoke over the tones, or ignored them. It cannot reveal whether the player was young or old, experienced or still learning. What it can show is that controlled sound had become portable. A person could carry a narrow object, lift it to the mouth, and produce tones available to everyone close enough to hear. That availability may have given music a special place within mobile communities. Food must be divided. Tools must be passed from hand to hand. A melody, rhythm, or repeated call can be heard by several people without being physically divided at all. The same sound can reach a child, an adult, and an older listener in one instant, even though each may understand it differently. Shared hearing does not mean shared meaning. One person may recognize a familiar pattern, while another may notice only pitch or rhythm. Cultural knowledge determines what a sound signifies, and that knowledge leaves almost no trace in the ground. Still, the possibility of collective attention is built into the instrument's function. This may help explain why the flute was worth making despite the labor and risk involved. Its value may not have belonged only to the player. It could have extended outward through the group, although archaeology cannot measure that value. Near the beginning of the known history of human music, this outward movement of sound matters. It suggests that an object shaped by one pair of hands could create an event larger than the object itself. The flute occupied little space, but the sound it produced could fill a shelter, cross a circle of listeners, and disappear without leaving anything behind. That disappearance is why social use must remain a hypothesis. No marks survive to show who listened or how they responded. Yet the instrument's acoustic reach gives us a firm starting point. Controlled sound could leave the maker's body and become present for others. In that brief interval, breath was no longer private. It entered a shared environment. For a mobile community, such an event required no permanent building and left no heavy structure behind. Yet it could still gather attention around a pattern carried by memory from one occasion to another. The ancient flute therefore reveals not only a technical relationship between bone and air, but also a social possibility. One person could shape a moment that several people experienced together before it vanished. Rhythm gives sound a structure that can be felt as well as heard. A repeated pulse can invite the body to anticipate what comes next, allowing hands, feet, breath, or movement to fall into a common pattern. In human life, rhythm helps people walk together, work together, remember sequences, or coordinate actions. It would be tempting to project these uses directly into the Ice Age and claim that ancient flutes organized hunting, labor, ceremony, or dance. The archaeological evidence does not permit such certainty. No preserved scene shows how the Hohlefels flute was used, and no trace records whether anyone moved in time with it. Yet the physical properties of rhythm make possibilities reasonable to examine. When a sound returns at regular intervals, listeners can begin to predict its timing. Prediction reduces the effort required to coordinate separate bodies. One person can begin an action, another can join it, and both can adjust to the same pattern without constant visual contact. A flute may have supported this kind of shared timing, although it may just as easily have been played without a steady beat. The instrument could produce sustained tones, short calls, repeated figures, or irregular phrases. Its existence shows capacity, not one fixed use. Rhythm also interacts with memory. A sequence arranged into repeated patterns is often easier to retain than a random series of events. This principle does not depend on writing. Human memory can hold pattern sound through repetition, bodily practice, and expectation. Early communities may have used repeated tones to support learning or recall, but the evidence cannot tell us what was remembered or whether practical information was attached to music. A melody might have carried no instruction. It may simply have been enjoyed, explored, or repeated because listeners found it familiar. Scientific restraint requires leaving these alternatives open. Even so, the connection between rhythm and memory matters for the origins of human culture. Before written records, continuity depended on bodies and minds. Skills survived because movements were watched, repeated, corrected, and remembered. Sounds could become another medium through which patterns travelled. A player who reproduced the same sequence across many occasions could make it recognizable to others. A listener could learn when to expect a change, even without knowing how to make the flute. Over time, such recognition might create a shared form, but the bone does not preserve how stable any form became. Coordination also need not mean large gatherings. Two people might align their movement. A child might imitate an adult. A small group might respond to a repeated call while preparing materials or resting near a shelter. These examples remain hypothetical, yet they show how little was required for sound to become socially useful. No permanent stage, audience, or formal performance was necessary. Breath, attention, and repeated timing were enough to create a temporary structure in the air. The structure vanished immediately, but memory could carry something of it forward. More than 30,000 years ago, the flute made such patterned sound physically possible through an object shaped for repeated use. That fact does not reveal whether the tones guided movement, marked time, accompanied work, or existed for their own sake. It reveals that early humans had created a device through which timing could be deliberately produced and altered. The significance lies in this controlled possibility. Rhythm may have helped coordinate people, but it may also have offered private concentration, experimentation, or pleasure. These functions are not mutually exclusive, and one instrument could have served different purposes on different occasions. The ancient flute therefore invites a conclusion. Sound could be organized in time, repeated through learned bodily action, and made available to others. Whether that organization guided hands, feet, memory, or nothing beyond attentive listening remains beyond the reach of the surviving evidence. Its social power came from a simple feature. Separate people could orient themselves toward the same returning sound. Music can create a sense of connection, but an ancient flute cannot tell us whether connection was its main purpose. Modern people use music in ceremonies, celebrations, mourning, work, play, worship, teaching, and private reflection. Because these uses are familiar, it is easy to place them unchanged into the Ice Age. That would be unsafe. The people who made the Hohlfeld's flute lived within social worlds that left no written description, and the instrument preserves no label explaining when or why it was played. Several interpretations remain possible, and more than one may have been true. Shared sound could have helped a small group focus on the same moment. Repeated tones might have become familiar across seasons, allowing listeners to recognize patterns associated with particular people or occasions. Music may also have offered pleasure without serving an obvious practical function. Curiosity, play, and enjoyment are human capacities, but archaeology cannot measure them directly in a prehistoric community. The flute does not need to have solved a survival problem in order to matter. Its manufacture already shows that time and skill were directed toward controlled sound, and that sound may have been valued for reasons that disappeared with the listeners. Some researchers have proposed that music can strengthen social bonds by coordinating attention, emotion, and movement. This idea is reasonable in general human behavior, yet the ancient evidence does not prove that the instrument was designed for bonding. A group might have heard it together, but one person might also have played alone. It could have accompanied a gathering on one occasion and private practice on another. A familiar player might have been welcomed, ignored, corrected, or asked to repeat a pattern. None of these responses left durable marks. Ritual use is another possibility that must be treated carefully. Caves, carved figures, ornaments, and musical objects can encourage modern observers to imagine formal ceremonies. Such ceremonies may have existed, but objects found in caves do not automatically become sacred. Caves were also places of shelter, work, food preparation, tool production, and repeated occupation. An instrument recovered there may have been used in ordinary life, in unusual events, or in both. The same caution applies to dance. Rhythm and melody can support movement, but no preserved footprint or body position links this particular flute to dancing. Near the beginning of the material record of human music, the most reliable conclusion is not a single function, but a range of social possibilities. Controlled sound could be shared, remembered, repeated, and recognized. It could alter the atmosphere of a small gathering without changing the physical surroundings. It could draw attention toward one person, allow several people to anticipate a pattern, or offer a temporary experience that belonged to no object once the final tone ended. These qualities may have contributed to cohesion, but cohesion is not the only explanation. Music can also express difference. A particular technique, pattern, or instrument might distinguish one player, family, generation, or community from another, though no such identities can be recovered here. Sound could bring people together while also marking who knew a tradition and who was still learning it. The flute therefore points towards social complexity without revealing a fixed social role. Its value may have shifted with context, age, skill, season, or memory. More than 30,000 years ago, people had created a means of shaping air into an event that others could hear but no one could keep. That flexibility itself may have made sound worth preserving, because one learned practice could enter many moments without being limited to one task. Whether that event strengthened bonds, marked transitions, entertained listeners, supported ritual, or simply pleased the player remains unanswered. The honest lesson is that early music did not need one permanent purpose. Like music now, it may have moved between usefulness and enjoyment, between the group and the individual, leaving only the instrument behind. Making a flute and playing a flute are two different achievements. The first depends on selecting material, shaping surfaces, opening holes, and preserving a fragile tube. The second depends on controlling breath, lips, tongue, fingers, hearing, and memory in real time. A person might understand how to carve bone without producing a clear tone, while another might learn to play an instrument made by someone else. The ancient flute therefore points not to one skill, but to a meeting between craft knowledge and bodily practice. Once the object was complete, it still had to be learned. Breath had to strike the prepared edge at a useful angle. Fingers had to close openings tightly enough to prevent unwanted air from escaping. Movements had to become steady, because hesitation or poor coverage could change the sound. The player also had to listen and adjust. A weak tone might come from breath pressure, lip position, a leaking hole, or a problem in the instrument itself. Distinguishing among these causes would require repeated experience. A familiar sequence could also guide practice, giving the learner an audible pattern against which each attempt could be compared. None of this knowledge was written down. It existed in bodies, habits, demonstrations, and remembered corrections. Archaeology cannot show how long a person practiced, how mistakes were explained, or whether learners began with simple tones before attempting longer patterns. Yet the instrument's design makes one conclusion reasonable. Successful use depended on learned coordination. A flute does not teach itself merely by being held. Someone must discover or receive the relationship between movement and sound, then repeat that relationship until it becomes reliable. This brings the object close to the origins of human teaching. Teaching does not require a formal school or spoken technical vocabulary. One person can show a hand position, repeat a breath, slow a movement, or allow another person to imitate. A learner can watch, listen, attempt, fail, and try again. Such processes leave almost no physical trace, but they are necessary whenever a difficult skill continues beyond one individual. The Hohlfeld's flute cannot prove that a named teacher stood beside a named student. It can only reveal a task complex enough that observation and practice would have been useful. The same is true of flute making. A successful maker may have learned how much pressure the bone could tolerate, where openings could be placed, and how a blowing edge should be shaped. These judgments could be rediscovered by trial, but repeated traditions reduce the need to begin from nothing. At the beginning of known musical technology, knowledge may therefore have moved along two paths at once. One path preserved how to construct the instrument. The other preserved how to animate it with the body. If either path disappeared, the flute would lose much of its value. A well-made instrument without a player would remain silent. A skilled player without an instrument would need to make one, obtain one, or use another form of sound. Their combination suggests a small network of dependence connecting makers, players, listeners, and learners. We should not assume that these were separate social roles. One person may have done several things, and skills may have varied across age, experience, or circumstance. What matters is that musical behavior required continuity. Breath ended with each tone, but technique could remain in memory. Bone could break, but another instrument could be made if knowledge survived. A player could die, but patterns might continue if others had heard, practiced, and remembered them. The flute therefore changes the question from what one early human could do to what a community could preserve. Its sound depended on an individual body, yet its tradition could outlast that body only through other people. More than 30,000 years ago, human musical ability was already tied to learning, repetition, and the fragile transfer of skill from one living person to another. Knowledge can survive without writing when people are able to show, repeat, and remember what they do. The ancient flute offers a clear example of this dependence. Its maker needed to know how bone or ivory responded to pressure, how openings affected airflow, and how fragile material could be shaped without breaking. Its player needed to know how breath, lips, fingers, and hearing work together. None of these skills could remain in the object alone. A flute preserves form, but not instruction. Someone encountering it without guidance might discover parts of its use through experiment, yet a practiced tradition would make learning faster, safer, and more reliable. Observation may therefore have been central. A learner could watch where a tool touched the bone, how lightly pressure was applied, or how a finished instrument was held. Small details would matter. The angle of a stone edge could determine whether the surface was scraped or split. The position of a finger could decide whether a hole closed completely. The shape of the mouth could change a weak breath into a stable tone. These details are difficult to describe even in modern language, but they can be demonstrated through action. Imitation turns visible movement into personal experience. A learner copies the motion, notices the result, and adjusts. Failure becomes part of the process. A cracked bone, a leaking hole, or an unstable sound can reveal that something needs to change, although the archaeological record rarely preserves the lesson itself. We should not imagine formal classrooms, fixed lessons, or specialized teachers unless evidence supports them. Learning may have occurred during ordinary work, through shared attention between relatives, companions, or more experienced members of a group. It may also have been uneven. Some people may have learned only to produce simple tones, others may have developed greater control. Some may have known how to make instruments without becoming skilled players. The surviving flute cannot show how knowledge was distributed. It can only show that enough knowledge came together for the object to be made and used. This matters for the deep history of human culture because traditions depend on more than invention. A discovery that remains with one person disappears when that person dies or forgets it. A practice becomes durable only when others can repeat it. Repetition does not produce perfect copies. Each learner may alter a movement slightly, choose different material, or prefer another sequence of sounds. Across generations, these small changes can preserve a tradition while also transforming it. The flute, therefore, belongs to a process in which continuity and variation existed together. A familiar method could guide the hands, while experience allowed adjustment to a particular bone, tool, or player. Memory carried more than a finished result. It carried an order of actions. Prepare the material, protect the tube, shape the edge, open the holes, test the sound, and correct what could still be corrected. The exact order may have differed, but any successful method required links between stages. Playing also depended on ordered memory. Fingers had to return to useful positions, breath had to be controlled, and audible patterns had to be recognized well enough to repeat. More than 30,000 years ago, this kind of knowledge could move through a community without leaving a written record. Its path was human attention. One person acted, another watched, and the movement entered a new body. Correction may have been gentle or direct, silent or spoken, but its surviving form is unknowable. What remains is evidence that difficult knowledge crossed between minds, often enough to become a practiced human inheritance. The instrument survived because material endured, but the tradition survived only while people continued to demonstrate, imitate, practice, and remember. In this way, the flute reveals a quiet foundation of human history. Culture begins not only when something is created, but when another person learns how to create or use it again. A flute can be made by one person, but a musical tradition cannot survive through one person alone, because every skill tied to the instrument depends on memory moving between living bodies, and when that movement stops, the knowledge can disappear even if the object remains. A bone tube may endure in dry soil, yet it does not preserve the pressure of breath, the exact position of the lips, the sequence of finger movements, or the small corrections that turn uncertain noise into a stable tone. These details survive only when someone sees them, hears them, practices them, and carries them forward, which means that the history of music is also a history of generations. An experienced player may repeat a familiar pattern while a younger listener slowly learns its shape. A maker may show how to protect a thin wall of bone while opening a hole, and another person may remember the gesture years later when the original instrument has broken. None of this requires a formal institution, but it does require attention, patience, and enough social continuity for knowledge to be shared more than once. The ancient flute therefore points toward a community larger than its maker, even if we cannot know how many people belonged to that community or how long the tradition lasted. One successful instrument might represent a brief experiment. Yet the existence of several flutes made from different materials suggests that controlled sound was supported by knowledge broad enough to be repeated. This repetition does not prove that every generation played the same melodies or valued music in the same way. Traditions can change while they continue. A new player may alter timing, a maker may shift a hole, or a group may prefer a different material. But continuity remains possible when the relationship between breath, fingers, hearing, and crafted form is understood again. This is important for the origins of human culture, because survival depends not only on what individuals discover, but on what groups prevent from being lost. Fire-making, tool production, food processing, routes through the landscape, and care for children all become more reliable when knowledge crosses between people. Musical skill belongs within this same human capacity for transmission. Although its purpose may not have been directly practical, it still required memory to outlast the moment. Sound itself vanished immediately, but the method of producing it could remain in another person, and through that transfer a temporary experience became a durable cultural possibility. The flute, therefore connects biological generations with historical time, a child born long after the first instrument was shaped could still learn a technique developed by people no longer alive, and that technique could then be adjusted, remembered, and passed onward again. We cannot identify the teachers, learners, families, or social relationships involved, and we should not invent them. Yet the instrument shows that human behaviour had already reached beyond the limits of one lifetime. More than 30,000 years ago, knowledge could travel through observation, imitation, correction, and memory, allowing a practice to remain available even as individual bodies aged and disappeared. This may be one reason the flute matters more than its small size suggests. It is evidence not only of what a person could make, but of what a population could preserve. A tradition is never contained entirely in an object. It lives in repeated acts, in the decision to show another person, in the willingness to practice, and in the memory that returns when the hands meet new material. The ancient flute remains silent in the earth. But before that silence, it may have belonged to a chain of learning whose full length can no longer be measured. Each successful transfer gave the practice another chance to survive changes in climate, movement, loss, and population. While each failure of transmission could erase techniques that no excavation would ever recover from stone or bone, the question of Neanderthal music cannot be answered by the Swabian flutes alone, because those securely identified instruments are associated with early modern humans. A different object from Slovenia has kept the question open for decades. It was recovered from Divje Babe I, a cave containing Middle Paleolithic deposits linked with Neanderthal occupation. The object is a fragment of a cave bear thigh bone, with several openings along its length. Soon after its discovery, researchers proposed that it might be a flute made and used by Neanderthals. If that interpretation is correct, the material evidence for controlled musical sound would extend beyond Homo sapiens and farther back in time. Yet the object remains disputed, and its uncertainty is as important as its possible meaning. A bone with aligned holes may resemble an instrument, but resemblance does not establish manufacture. Carnivores can puncture bones with their teeth, especially when feeding on young animals whose bones are thinner and easier to break. Some specialists have argued that the openings and surrounding damage on the Divje Babe bone are consistent with bites, gnawing, or pressure from carnivore jaws. In this view, the apparent arrangement is accidental, and later breakage may have made the fragment look more flute-like than it originally was. Other researchers have examined the same object and reached a different conclusion. They have pointed to features they believe are difficult to explain through animal activity alone, including the relationship between the openings, possible traces of deliberate modification, and the ability of reconstructed forms to produce several pitches. Experimental replicas have shown that a playable instrument can be made from the surviving shape, but playability by itself does not prove that the ancient bone was intentionally created for music. Many natural objects can produce sound when modern people adapt or interpret them. The central problem is therefore not whether a replica can be played. It is whether the original holes were made through a controlled human sequence rather than through teeth, damage, or later processes inside the cave. Microscopic study, imaging, comparison with carnivore marks, and experimental work have all contributed to the debate, but scholars have not reached a universal agreement. This disagreement should not be treated as a failure of science. It shows how evidence is tested when one small object carries a very large claim. Accepting it too quickly could turn ambiguous damage into proof of Neanderthal music. Rejecting it too quickly could erase a genuine behavior simply because it does not fit older expectations. The responsible position is to describe both the evidence and its limits. The Divje Babe bone may be an intentionally made sound instrument, but it does not hold the same broad level of acceptance as the Aurignacian bird bone and ivory flutes associated with Homo sapiens. This difference does not mean Neanderthals lacked music. Voices, clapping, striking objects, or instruments made from wood and other perishable materials could have existed without surviving. It means only that secure material proof remains difficult. The question returns us to the beginning of human sound, where absence and uncertainty must be separated. No confirmed flute is required to recognize that Neanderthals had complex lives, cared for members of their groups, used fire, made varied tools, and adapted to demanding environments. Music is a separate claim and must rest on its own evidence. The Divje Babe fragment stands at that boundary. Its openings invite the possibility that Neanderthal breath once passed through bone, yet the marks also allow explanations that do not involve music. Its importance lies precisely in this uncertainty, because it forces us to distinguish what an object can suggest from what the surviving marks are strong enough to demonstrate with confidence. Until the evidence becomes clearer, the object should remain neither a proven flute nor a meaningless curiosity, but a careful reminder that deep history is sometimes preserved in forms too incomplete to carry one final answer. The absence of a securely identified Neanderthal flute does not prove that Neanderthals lived without music. Archaeology preserves only a narrow portion of behavior, and sound is among the least durable elements of human life. A voice leaves no object behind. Hands striking together vanish without trace. Rhythm made on skin, wood, stone, or the ground may survive only if the material and context are unusually favorable. Instruments made from reeds, bark, wood, hide, or fiber decay far more easily than stone or dense bone. Even bone can break, burn, dissolve, or remain unrecognized among ordinary animal remains. This means that the surviving record is shaped not only by what people did, but also by what materials they used, where those materials were left, and whether later conditions allowed them to remain. Neanderthals occupied Europe and regions of Western Asia across immense spans of time and changing environments. Their sites were not preserved evenly. Some caves protected layers, while open landscapes were eroded, buried deeply, or destroyed. A musical practice carried mainly by voice or perishable instruments could have existed for generations and still leave nothing that modern researchers could identify with confidence. This possibility should remain open, but it must not be turned into a claim that music certainly existed. Possibility and evidence are different. The responsible conclusion is that the current archaeological record does not allow a final answer. We have stronger material evidence for flutes associated with early modern humans in the Aurad nation than we have for Neanderthals. That difference may reflect real differences in behavior, but it may also reflect preservation, population size, research history, or the kinds of materials each group used. More objects from one population do not automatically mean that population possessed every relevant ability while another lacked it. The beginning of human musical behavior is especially difficult to locate, because the earliest forms may not have required crafted instruments at all. Breath, voice, repeated calls, clapping, tapping, and coordinated movement were available to human bodies before bone or ivory was shaped into a flute. None of these actions would leave a clear archaeological signature by themselves. A community could maintain complex patterns of sound through memory and imitation without producing any durable artifact. For this reason, the oldest accepted flute marks the earliest secure surviving evidence of one musical technology, not the absolute beginning of music, and not the boundary of musical capacity between human populations. The same caution applies when comparing Neanderthals with Homo sapiens. Neanderthals made sophisticated stone tools, used fire, hunted large animals, processed hides, used pigments in some contexts, and adapted to varied climates. These behaviors show planning, learning, cooperation, and technical knowledge. They do not prove music, but they warn against treating Neanderthals as creatures incapable of complex cultural practices unless a flute is found. Music must be evaluated on its own evidence, not assumed from intelligence and not denied from silence. The Divje Babe bone remains important because it may preserve a rare trace, yet even if it is eventually judged to be natural damage, the broader question would remain open. One disputed object cannot carry the entire history of Neanderthal sound. The deeper lesson is that absence in archaeology has several meanings. It may indicate that a behavior was rare, that it was expressed through fragile materials, that relevant sites have not survived, or that researchers have not yet recognized the evidence. Sometimes it may indicate genuine absence, but that conclusion requires comparison across many sites and forms of evidence. When the subject is music, the earth has filtered away almost everything we would most want to hear. The silence surrounding Neanderthals is therefore not a recovered silence from their lives. That distinction keeps uncertainty honest without closing the question. It is the silence of an incomplete record, and it should be approached with curiosity, restraint, and no conclusion stronger than the evidence can hold. The secure or Ignatian flutes from the Swabian Jura tell us something clear, but not everything we might wish to know. They show that early modern humans in Europe made instruments designed for controlled sound from bird bone and mammoth ivory. Their openings, blowing edges, tool marks, and workable acoustic forms support the conclusion that these objects were intentionally manufactured and used as flutes. This evidence is strong because several features agree with one another. The materials were deliberately shaped, the holes were placed where fingers could reach them, and the instruments could alter pitch through changes in airflow and finger position. Yet even this strong evidence has boundaries. It does not prove that these were the first musical instruments ever made. It does not prove that earlier humans lacked music. It does not prove that every Aurignacian community used sound in the same way. The oldest secure object is only the oldest secure object that has survived, been found, recognized, and studied. A flute made earlier from wood, reed, bark, or another fragile material could disappear completely. A vocal tradition could continue for thousands of years without leaving any physical remains. The accepted flutes, therefore, mark a visible point in the history of musical technology, not the birth of music itself. The comparison with Neanderthals makes this distinction especially important. The Divje Bay bone may represent an intentionally modified instrument, but the origin of its openings remains debated. Because alternative explanations involving carnivore damage have not been dismissed to universal satisfaction, it cannot be treated as evidence equal in certainty to the Swabian flutes. This difference concerns the strength of the objects, not the worth of the human populations associated with them. Science does not rank species by how appealing a discovery appears. It asks whether marks can be explained most convincingly by human action, whether context is secure, and whether repeated examination supports the same conclusion. For early modern humans in the Swabian Jura, the surviving instruments provide that level of support. For Neanderthal music, the material record remains uncertain. Uncertainty does not mean impossibility. It means that a conclusion must wait. That restraint protects both populations from modern stories that would make one fully human through music and reduce the other to silence without sufficient archaeological support or evidence. This is one of the quiet lessons the ancient flute offers about human origins. The past does not divide neatly into those who possessed music and those who did not. Evidence survives unevenly, and cultural behavior may exist long before archaeology can see it. A flute can demonstrate the ability to make controlled tones, but it cannot measure the full range of sounds in a community. Voice, rhythm, movement, imitation, and instruments made from perishable materials remain outside the surviving record unless unusual conditions preserve them. We should therefore avoid turning one discovery into a boundary between human kinds. The Swabian flutes expand what can be stated with confidence about early Homo sapiens. They show technical planning, learned bodily control, material knowledge, and the repeated production of varied sound. They do not show that Neanderthals were silent, that music belonged to one species alone, or that musical behavior began at one exact moment. The honest conclusion is narrower and stronger. More than 30,000 years ago, modern humans in this region were making sophisticated wind instruments, and archaeology can demonstrate this through objects that survived. Beyond that statement lies a larger field of possibility, shaped by lost materials and lost traditions. The flute changes our understanding because it provides firm evidence where silence once appeared complete. It also teaches restraint, because every clear discovery stands beside questions that remain unanswered. What it reveals is significant, but what it cannot reveal is equally important. Between secure proof and total absence lies most of the human past, waiting to be approached without forcing uncertain traces into answers they cannot yet support. For a long time, the distant human past was described mainly through hunger, cold, danger, and the struggle to remain alive. This picture was not entirely wrong. Early people did face unstable climates, difficult landscapes, injuries, predators, and the constant need to find food, shelter, fuel, and useful materials. Stone tools and butchered animal bones preserve these pressures clearly, so they naturally became central to archaeological interpretation. Yet the evidence that survives most easily can shape the questions researchers ask. A sharpened edge is easier to recognize than a vanished song. A hearth leaves ash, while a shared rhythm leaves nothing unless an instrument remains. When the record favours tools of survival, the people behind those tools can begin to appear as though survival was their only concern. The ancient flutes disturbed this narrow image because they preserved an activity that could not be reduced to cutting meat, scraping hide, or defending a camp. Their makers invested time in objects whose usefulness depended on controlled sound. This does not mean practical needs became unimportant, or that early humans lived in comfort. The same communities still had to respond to cold, movement, illness, and uncertainty. The deeper lesson is that necessity and expression could exist together. A person did not need to escape hardship before shaping bone for tone. A group did not need permanent houses before carrying learned patterns from one place to another. Human life could contain labour, fear, care, curiosity, memory, and sound within the same day, even though archaeology preserves these dimensions unevenly. The older image of Ice Age people often treated creativity as a late addition, something that appeared only after basic survival had been secured. The flute suggests a different relationship. Creativity may have been woven into the very practices through which people endured. Careful attention used to read animal tracks could also guide the placement of finger holes. Memory used to follow routes across a landscape could also preserve a sequence of tones. Hands skilled in shaping tools could also shape an object meant to be heard. These comparisons do not prove that the same mental process served every task, but they show why the boundary between survival and culture may be misleading. From the beginning of the known history of Homo sapiens in Europe, technical life and expressive life appear beside one another in the same archaeological settings. Figurines, ornaments, pigments, and flutes do not erase the harshness of the Ice Age. They reveal that hardship did not occupy the entire human mind. This matters because modern accounts can unintentionally reduce early people to bodies reacting to the environment, as though they lack traditions unless those traditions improved immediate survival. The flute offers evidence that people also created experiences whose value depended on hearing, recognition, repetition, and perhaps shared attention. Its exact purpose remains unknown, and it should not be turned into proof of ceremony, entertainment, or social bonding. Even without assigning a function, the instrument changes the scale of the question. It asks us to consider what else was present but lost, because it was made from breath, movement, wood, skin, or memory. The archaeological record is not a full account of human life. It is a filtered remainder shaped by durability, burial, discovery, and interpretation. Once this is understood, early humans appear neither as simple survivors nor as modern people placed in an ancient landscape. They appear as populations whose lives were complex in ways the surviving evidence can only incompletely reveal. It also reminds us that every archaeological silence must be examined carefully, because missing evidence can reflect decay and chance as readily as it can reflect a behaviour that never existed among those earlier distant human communities. The flute did not create that complexity. It exposed one fragment of it, reminding us that the beginning of human cultural history was probably richer than the materials that happened to endure. Survival and creativity are often described as if they belong to different stages of human life. In this view, people first secure food, warmth, and safety, and only later turn toward music, images, ornaments, or play. The Ice Age flute complicates that sequence. The people who made it did not live beyond danger. They still faced cold seasons, uncertain movement of animals, injury, hunger, and the demands of caring for children and other members of the group. Their tools had to work, fires had to be maintained, routes had to be remembered. Yet within that same world, time and attention were also given to shaping bone and ivory for sound. This does not mean creativity floated free from necessity. It may have grown inside practical life, using the same patience, memory, and hand control required for other tasks. A person who understood how bone fractured could apply that knowledge to both a point and a flute. Someone who could observe small changes in weather, animal behavior, or material quality could also notice how a change in airflow altered a tone. These connections do not prove that music improved survival, and they should not be used to invent a direct advantage. They show only that the human capacities involved in survival were broad enough to support more than one kind of result. The same body could hunt, carry, cut, listen, remember, and shape sound. This matters for the beginning of human cultural history, because it removes a false boundary. Expression did not need to wait for a world without hardship. No prehistoric community ever finished the work of survival. Food had to be found again, tools repaired again, children protected again, and weather faced again. If music existed within such conditions, then creativity was not a reward placed at the end of necessity. It was one way human attention moved through necessity. The flute may have offered pleasure, concentration, recognition, or shared experience, but the evidence does not allow one function to become certain. Its importance remains even without a final explanation. People invested effort in a fragile object whose value appeared only through controlled breath and listening. That investment tells us that not every meaningful activity had to leave a practical product, such as meat, shelter, or a sharper edge. Some human actions may have mattered because they organized experience itself. A repeated sound could make time feel patterned. A familiar tone could connect one moment with another. A crafted object could carry a learned practice across distance and generations. These possibilities remain cautious because the original settings are lost, yet they help explain why the flute changes the questions we ask. It turns attention away from whether early humans were merely surviving and toward how survival was lived from within. A life can be difficult and still contain memory, curiosity, discipline, and enjoyment. Recognizing this does not make the Ice Age peaceful or comfortable. It restores complexity without softening danger. The flute does not prove that early people were happier, more spiritual, or more socially united than the evidence shows. It proves that some of them created controlled sound through demanding craftsmanship. That single fact is enough to challenge the idea that creativity begins only after material need has been solved. More than 30,000 years ago, the human past already included objects that did not feed the body directly, but may have shaped attention, memory, and shared time. The beginning of human expression was therefore not outside the struggle to live. It was carried through that struggle, made by the same hands, within the same uncertain landscape, and preserved by chance in the same ground as broken tools and animal bone. Even under pressure, human attention could reach beyond immediate need and create patterns valued for reasons now permanently lost. The flute remains quiet now, yet its silence reveals that necessity never occupied the whole of human life. The flute changed research not because it answered every question, but because it forced new ones to be asked. Before such instruments were recognized, early modern humans in Ice Age Europe could be studied mainly through stone tools, animal remains, hearths, and movement across landscapes. These materials revealed hunting, cutting, transport, and adaptation with great clarity. The flute added another category of behavior that could not be explained only through immediate physical need. It showed that some people shaped material for controlled sound, and this opened a wider field of inquiry. Researchers could now ask how breath was trained, how finger positions were remembered, how complex techniques were learned, and how sound may have entered social life. None of these questions can be answered fully by one object, yet the object makes them legitimate. This is an important difference. Archaeology does not change only when a discovery provides a final conclusion. It also changes when evidence expands the range of possibilities that can be investigated responsibly. The flute encouraged closer attention to fragile materials, broken bone fragments, unusual holes, and objects once dismissed as ordinary debris. It also encouraged comparison between sites, materials, and methods of manufacture. A bird bone flute and an ivory flute do not reveal identical processes, but together they show that sound production could be approached through more than one technical solution. This suggests repeated engagement rather than a single accident, while still leaving the scale and duration of the tradition uncertain. For the study of human origins, the deeper shift concerns how intelligence is recognized. Intelligence is not preserved directly in the ground. Archaeologists infer abilities from patterns of action recorded in objects and contexts. A flute can support inferences about planning, fine motor control, hearing, memory, and learning, but it cannot measure a mind or prove that one population suddenly crossed a fixed cognitive boundary. Early humans did not become fully capable at the moment this instrument was made. Their abilities had histories that extended backward through generations, and many earlier traces may have disappeared. The flute therefore changes our picture without providing a simple before and after. it also changes how social life is considered. A tool can reveal an individual action, but a musical tradition raises questions about listeners, learners, makers, and the continuity of knowledge. Did several people know how to play? Were instruments exchanged, repaired, or copied? Did children hear familiar patterns and later reproduce them? The evidence cannot answer these details, but it shows why population structure and transmission matter. A practice survives only when enough people maintain it across time. This connects a small object with larger historical processes such as mobility, contact, loss, and generational change. Near the beginning of the known history of Homo sapiens in Europe, sound-making technology already depended on bodies, materials, and memory working together. The flute does not tell us what early humans thought about themselves. It does not reveal their beliefs, emotions, or intentions. It does something more limited and more reliable. It shows that their lives included carefully made possibilities for sound, and that these possibilities were complex enough to require new scientific questions. Its greatest effect was not to prove that ancient people were just like us. It was to make an older, narrower image impossible to maintain without revision. Once controlled music entered the archaeological record, early humans could no longer be described only through what they killed, ate, carried, or endured. The instrument added hearing, practice, and cultural continuity to the evidence. It also reminded researchers that vanished behaviors may leave indirect traces in preparation, wear, repetition, and association, even when the original performance itself has disappeared beyond recovery. Absence now became part of the evidence. A small piece of bone, therefore, altered the scale of inquiry, not by delivering a dramatic answer, but by showing how much of human life had been missing from the questions themselves. The flute has survived, but not a single melody has travelled with it. The bone remains measurable. Its holes can be photographed, its surface examined, and its shape compared with replicas. The sound itself is gone. No sequence of notes lies hidden inside the material, waiting to be released by modern breath. When researchers play a reconstruction, they produce a new performance guided by present hands, present ears, and present expectations. They do not awaken an ancient song. This distinction returns us to the deepest imbalance in the archaeological record. Objects can endure after the moments that gave them meaning have vanished. A flute may remain for tens of thousands of years, while every breath that entered it disappears almost immediately. The people who listened also disappear, taking with them the memories that allowed one pattern to be recognized as familiar and another as strange. We cannot know whether a melody returned night after night, whether one player favoured a repeated phrase, or whether different communities used entirely different forms of sound. No notation survives. No written description explains tempo, pitch, rhythm, or purpose. Even the idea of a complete melody may reflect modern habits more than ancient practice. The instrument may have carried short calls, long tones, repeated patterns, experiments, signals, or combinations that do not fit later categories. The safest conclusion is that controlled sound occurred, not that it followed any musical form known today. This lost content matters because human culture often lives in arrangements rather than materials. The bone provided a tool, but the meaningful pattern existed only while a person played and another person remembered. Once memory failed, the sequence could disappear even if the instrument remained usable. A tradition might survive for generations through imitation, then end within a small population after movement, death, separation, or changing preference. Nothing in the ground would record the final performance. The last player could place the flute down without knowing that a pattern carried across many lives would never be heard again. This is not a dramatic claim about one identifiable event. It is a general consequence of oral transmission. Practices without writing or recording depend on people, and people are vulnerable to time. Near the beginning of the known history of musical instruments, sound was preserved only by being made again. Each performance renewed it, but none could store it. The ancient flute, therefore, represents both human achievement and irreversible loss. It proves that a system of breath, fingers, and material once existed, while refusing to reveal the content created through that system. Archaeology can reconstruct possible pitches, estimate playing positions, and identify technical choices. It cannot restore the silence between tones, the length of a pause, the response of listeners, or the memories attached to a repeated sound. These absences are not small details added around a recovered composition. They are most of the composition's human meaning. A modern player can fill the tube with air, but cannot fill the surrounding moment with the same relationships, expectations, and history. The flute's voice today is physically possible yet culturally new. That does not make replicas useless. They help test function and reveal how demanding the instrument may have been to play. They also demonstrate the boundary between experiment and recovery. We can hear what a similar object can do, but not what this object once did within its own world. More than 30,000 years ago, people created sounds that may have mattered enough to repeat, teach, and remember. Every one of those sounds has ended. Its silence reminds us that the most important human inheritance may sometimes leave no durable object, surviving only through repetition until one interrupted generation allows a whole chain of memory to dissolve. The surviving flute is therefore not a container of lost music. It is evidence that lost music existed, an object standing where an entire audible history has disappeared. The flute is only one survivor from a much larger world of sound. Its bone endured because mineral-rich material can remain under favourable conditions. But many other ways of making music were built from substances that decay quickly. Wood can rot, split, burn, or be eaten by insects. Reed and bark can collapse into the soil, hide can dry, tear, or disappear. Fibre can unravel until no recognisable shape remains. A drum, rattle, whistle, stringed object, or simple clapper made from these materials might vanish so completely that later archaeologists would never know it had existed. Even when a fragment survives, its purpose may be impossible to recognise. A short piece of wood may look like fuel. A pierced shell may be interpreted as an ornament rather than a component of a sound-making object. A smooth stone may have been struck repeatedly, yet its marks may resemble ordinary wear. The surviving record therefore favours instruments that were both durable and identifiable, while hiding those that were fragile, simple, or used in ways that left little physical change. Voice leaves even less behind. The human throat can vary pitch, volume, rhythm, and tone without any crafted object. People can hum, call, chant, imitate animals, speak in patterned phrases, or combine breath with movement. Clapping requires only hands. Stamping requires only feet and ground. Two pieces of wood can create a pulse, and stones can be struck together for sound rather than cutting. These actions may have been present long before the oldest known flute, but no direct evidence can establish when they began. The body itself was the earliest available instrument, yet bodies do not preserve performances. Bones can show anatomy, while soft tissues, habits, and learned vocal techniques disappear. This gap changes how the beginning of music should be understood. The first surviving instrument is not necessarily the first form of organized sound. It is simply the earliest point where material, context, and human modification combine strongly enough for researchers to identify musical technology with confidence. Before that point lies a vast field of possible behavior that cannot be filled with certainty. We should neither assume rich musical traditions without evidence, nor imagine complete silence simply because fragile traces are missing. The honest position remains between those extremes. More than 30,000 years ago, the known flute reveals that one tradition of controlled sound had entered durable material. Around it, countless other sounds may have existed through voice, movement, wood, skin, or fibre, but the earth kept almost none of them. This means that the cultural life of early humans was probably broader than the collection of surviving instruments, although its exact form cannot be recovered. A cave deposit can preserve stone flakes, animal bones, and one broken flute while losing every soft object used beside them. The apparent rarity of music in archaeology may therefore reflect preservation as much as behaviour. The flute becomes important not because it stood alone in an otherwise silent world, but because it crossed the boundary between an activity that vanished and an object that endured. It gives one durable outline to a landscape of lost practices. Every opening in the bone points beyond itself toward breaths, gestures, rhythms, and materials that left no equivalent trace. Archaeology can identify the survivor, but it cannot count everything that disappeared around it. The deeper human past was not made only from what reached museums. It was also made from temporary things. Voices shared once, patterns repeated for a season, wooden objects worn smooth and later burned, skins stretched and discarded, and movements remembered only while living people continued them. The ancient flute is therefore both evidence and warning, showing that sound mattered enough to enter crafted form, while reminding us that most of the audible world from which it came has been erased, leaving only a narrow material echo of experiences once carried through vulnerable human memory. Silence in archaeology is not empty, but it must be handled with care. When an instrument survives without its melodies, researchers are left with two kinds of evidence at once: what the object clearly shows and what its missing context refuses to reveal. The flute can be measured. Its material can be identified. Tool marks can be examined, and replicas can test whether its form could produce controlled tones. These observations belong to the stronger side of the record. Beyond them lie questions about who played, who listened, what patterns were repeated, and why the sounds mattered. Those questions are reasonable, yet they cannot be answered by replacing absence with an attractive story. Scientific honesty begins by keeping different levels of certainty separate. Some conclusions rest directly on physical features. Others are supported by comparison and experiment, but remain open to revision. Still others are possibilities that help guide research without becoming claims about what certainly happened. This distinction protects the human past from being simplified into either complete silence or invented detail. A missing answer can still shape understanding. If no notation survives, researchers learn that melodic content cannot be recovered. If no perishable instruments remain, they recognize that the known collection may represent only a small fraction of ancient sound making. If several flutes appear in related archaeological settings, they may reasonably discuss repeated practice, while avoiding claims about a single fixed tradition. The gap, therefore, becomes integral to the method. This discipline also prevents modern expectations from becoming hidden evidence. A familiar tone may sound mournful or peaceful to us, but that response belongs to our own histories of listening. Without surviving testimony, it cannot be assigned to Ice Age performers or audiences as though meaning travelled unchanged across tens of thousands of years with certainty. It defines the boundary around what evidence can carry. This boundary is especially important in the study of human origins, where one rare object can attract large conclusions. The ancient flute may suggest learning, memory, skilled manufacture, and shared attention, because its creation and use required those capacities in some form. It cannot tell us the emotional meaning of a performance, or prove that music held one universal social function. It may have been used in many settings, or its role may have changed over time. Leaving those alternatives open is not weakness. It is a more accurate response to an incomplete record. Archaeologists often work by comparing many small clues rather than trusting one dramatic feature. The position of a hole, the direction of a cut, the layer of sediment, the condition of nearby animal bone, and the distribution of similar objects can support or weaken an interpretation. When these lines agree, confidence increases. When they conflict, uncertainty remains visible. The same patience applies to absence. A behavior may leave no trace because it never occurred, because its materials decayed, because relevant sites were destroyed, or because evidence has not yet been recognized. No single explanation should be chosen without support. More than 30,000 years ago, people shaped instruments that allow controlled sound to enter the archaeological record. Almost everything around those sounds has vanished. The responsible task is not to fill every silence, but to understand what kind of silence it is. Some silence marks permanent loss. Some reflects the limits of excavation. Some may change when new evidence appears. The flute teaches that a careful question can be more valuable than a confident invention. Its holes, material, and workmanship give us a secure foundation. Its vanished melodies preserve a boundary that should not be crossed without evidence. By respecting both the object and the gap around it, we gain a truer picture of early humans, not figures trapped in silence, and not characters supplied with imagined songs, but real people whose surviving traces are meaningful, precisely because so much of their lived world can no longer be known. The ancient flute brings together several abilities that are often studied separately, yet in the finished object they became one continuous human act. A suitable piece of bone or ivory had to be recognized, prepared, protected from breakage, shaped with care, opened in useful places. tested through breath, and remembered well enough for the same relationship between hand and sound to be repeated. None of these steps proves that early humans possessed modern musical theory, and none allows us to recover their thoughts, but together they show a practical intelligence grounded in material, body, hearing, and time. The maker had to understand that natural form could be altered toward a result that did not yet exist. A hollow bird bone could become an instrument only when edges and openings were prepared, while solid ivory required an even longer sequence in which two halves were carved, hollowed, aligned, and joined into a single tube. This was not merely careful workmanship. It was the coordination of many small decisions around a future event, the arrival of sound when breath finally entered the completed form. The player then added another layer of knowledge. Lungs had to provide stable pressure, lips had to guide the air. Fingers had to cover and uncover openings with enough accuracy to change the vibrating column inside. And hearing had to recognize whether the result matched a remembered movement. The object, therefore, did not contain music by itself. Its function appeared only when a living body completed it. This relationship between crafted material and learned action is central to the long history of human culture, because tools become traditions only when people know not only how to make them, but how to use them again. A flute left in the ground can survive, yet the technique of playing survives only through attention, imitation, correction, and memory. The same is true of the knowledge required to make another instrument after the first one breaks, which means that the surviving flute points beyond one individual toward a chain of learning, perhaps short, perhaps extended across many generations, though the evidence cannot measure its full length. This chain matters because human history is built from repeated transfer. One person notices a useful property, another learns the action, a later person adjusts it, and a practice continues while also changing. The flute reveals that such transfer could preserve something whose value was not limited to food, warmth, or immediate protection. Controlled sound could be carried through memory, recreated in new places, and renewed by bodies that had never met the original maker. Near the beginning of the secure archaeological record for musical instruments, breath had already become more than a biological necessity. It had become a force directed through culture. The same air that kept the body alive could be shaped into differences of pitch, timing, and intensity, then released into a shared space where others might hear it. We cannot know what those listeners understood, whether the sounds were familiar, useful, comforting, playful, or connected to occasions now lost. But the instrument shows that human attention had reached into the invisible behavior of air and turned that behavior into a repeatable practice. Its importance also lies in the balance between certainty and restraint, because the physical object supports clear conclusions about manufacture and acoustic control, while leaving intention, emotion, ownership, and meaning unresolved, allowing the flute to expand our understanding without turning a rare survival into a complete portrait of prehistoric life, or human consciousness itself. This is the deeper capability preserved in the bone, not a single melody, not a claim that music began at one date, and not proof that one population possessed a unique mind, but evidence that early humans could join perception, planning, fine movement, learning, and social transmission around an object whose full purpose existed only for a moment, while breath moved through it and became sound. Human inheritance has never consisted only of objects, because an object becomes useful only when people know what to do with it, and a flute makes this especially clear. The bone can survive, but the practice of turning breath into controlled sound survives only when someone remembers the movements, recognizes the result, and helps another person repeat it. This means that the deepest human inheritance is often carried through attention rather than material. One generation watches another, a gesture is copied, a mistake is corrected, and a skill enters a new body. The instrument may change, the material may change, and the people may move across a different landscape. Yet the practice can continue because knowledge is not tied to one object. This is one reason the ancient flute has educational value today. It reminds us that human history is not built only from inventions that remain visible, but also from fragile acts of teaching and remembering that usually disappear. A sharpened stone can be placed in a museum, while the exact movement used to make it may be lost. A carved figure can survive, while the stories or gestures connected with it vanish, and a flute can remain silent after every melody is gone. These losses do not make the objects meaningless. They reveal how much human life always existed beyond matter. More than 30,000 years ago, people were already preserving knowledge through repetition, and that knowledge could cross the boundary between one lifetime and another. The same process allowed roots, tool methods, food practices, care, and social habits to remain available after the individuals who first learned them were gone. Music belonged to this wider capacity for cultural continuity. Even if its exact purpose cannot be known, a person did not need to leave written instructions for another to learn how to hold the instrument, direct breath, or cover the holes. Repeated demonstration could carry enough information for the skill to continue, and each successful transfer enlarged the memory of the group. This does not mean traditions remained unchanged, because every learner brings a different body, different experience, and different circumstances. But continuity does not require perfect copying. It requires enough stability for a practice to remain recognizable while adapting to new hands. The flute therefore connects personal learning with the longer movement of human history. It shows that early culture could outlast individuals without buildings, archives, or written records, and that memory itself functioned as a form of preservation. This should also make us cautious about judging the past only by what endured, because the most important achievements may have been systems of knowledge that left no durable shape. A community could lose an instrument and make another, but if the method of making and playing disappeared, the tradition would be gone even if several old flutes remained in the soil. The true continuity existed in living relationships, in the willingness to show, observe, practice, and remember. This is the larger message carried by the ancient flute. Human beings survive not only by making useful things, but by creating ways for understanding to move between minds. And when that movement succeeds, one person's experience can become woven into a future they will never see. The lesson reaches beyond music, because every society depends on people who receive knowledge they did not create and decide whether to carry it forward. Some practices remain because they are useful, others because they hold identity, memory, beauty, or shared attention, and many disappear when population loss, movement, conflict, or neglect interrupts transmission. The flute cannot tell us which pressures shaped its tradition, but it shows that cultural survival has been as vulnerable as the people who sustain it. The instrument is therefore a small material witness to a vast invisible process, the process by which culture extends human life beyond the limits of one body, one place, and one generation. The ancient flute rests in silence now, held behind glass, measured by instruments, described in careful language, and separated from every breath that once gave it life. Yet its silence is not empty, because the object carries a final lesson about what human history can preserve and what it must lose. The bone tells us that early modern humans could choose material, shape it with precision, understand the practical behavior of air, train the body to produce controlled sound, and pass difficult knowledge between people. But it cannot return the melodies, the listeners, the memories, or the meanings that surrounded those acts. This boundary is not a weakness in the evidence. It is part of the truth, because honest history must protect the difference between what survives and what imagination wishes to restore. The flute changed what we thought early humans could do, not by proving that they were identical to us, not by establishing the first moment of music, and not by revealing a sudden transformation of the human mind. It changed the picture, because it showed that people living in demanding Ice Age environments created complex sound-making instruments, while also meeting the ordinary pressures of food, movement, cold, injury, and care. Their lives could not be reduced to survival alone. Yet neither should they be romanticized into a peaceful world of constant art and music. The evidence supports a more balanced understanding. Human beings could respond to necessity, while also creating patterns that organized attention, memory, skill, and shared experience. And these capacities may have been developing long before durable instruments entered the archaeological record. Voices, clapping, rhythm, wood, reed, hide, and fibre could all disappear, leaving the oldest accepted flute as the earliest secure material witness rather than the absolute beginning. This distinction gives the discovery its true value, because it invites curiosity without replacing uncertainty with spectacle. It teaches that a small object can widen our view of humanity while remaining unable to answer every question placed upon it. And it reminds us that science becomes trustworthy not when it claims complete knowledge, but when it states clearly where knowledge ends. From this perspective, the flute belongs not only to the history of music, but to the history of learning, cooperation, memory, and cultural survival. One person may have made an instrument, another may have learned to play it, others may have listened, copied, corrected, remembered, or changed what they heard, and through these living relationships a practice could continue beyond the life of any single maker. From one vulnerable generation to another across changing landscapes, and through long stretches of unrecorded human time, the object survived through chemistry and burial, but the tradition survived only through people, which means that the most important part of its history was always more fragile than the bone itself. This is also true of the inheritance we carry today. Knowledge remains alive only when it is examined, taught, questioned, and passed onward with care, and evidence remains valuable only when we resist forcing it to say more than it can support. The ancient flute, therefore, leaves us with both wonder and responsibility. Wonder that human breath was being shaped through crafted materials so deep in the past, and responsibility to describe that achievement without inventing the world around it, somewhere beyond the reach of excavation. The final ancient melody ended, the final listener who remembered it disappeared, and an entire audible tradition may have passed into silence without leaving a name, a story, or a single recoverable note. The flute remains as proof that something happened, but not as a record of everything it meant, and so the ending cannot be a conclusion, only a question carried gently into the darkness. How much of what first made human life recognizably human once existed in sound? Movement, memory, and shared attention then vanished before history learned how to keep it.